Right now, sitting in your car, there are parts made by a company that just vanished about $9 billion. dollars. The brake pads, the wiper blades, the oil filter, there is a good chance they came from this one company. And you have almost certainly never heard its name. For years, it looked like the most boring business on earth: spark plugs and fuel pumps. And then, in a single autumn, it collapsed into one of the biggest hidden frauds Wall Street never saw coming. Here is the part that stops people cold. A company with about $5 billion dollars in sales every year just filed for bankruptcy with $12 million dollars left in the bank. That is not a typo. $5 billion dollars in sales, $12 million dollars in cash. Every famous fraud you can name had a genius villain and a flashy product. This one had spark plugs, a man nobody could even picture, and a boring accounting trick that is completely legal right up until you use it as a weapon. This is the story of First Brands, and of the one trick that let it sell the very same invoice two, even three times over. It starts with a man almost nobody could picture. Patrick James was born in Malaysia, schooled in Ohio, and he built his empire in near total silence. No magazine covers, no big interviews, just quiet deal after quiet deal. Starting back in the 1990s, James bought up small, unglamorous parts makers. Trico, the windshield wipers, had been his cornerstone for years. Then he went big. In 2019, he bought Fram oil filters and Autolite spark plugs for $310 million. The next year, in 2020, he grabbed Ray Bestos, the brake brand, and Champion Labs. He kept going. Performance brakes, towing gear, more than 24 household names, all under one roof. He called it First Brands. By 2024, it was doing around $5 billion dollars a year. It employed roughly 25,000 people, with factories on several continents. And Wall Street loved it. The logic felt bulletproof. Cars always break. People always need brakes and filters in a boom or in a recession. It was the safest, dullest money on Wall Street, which is exactly why nobody looked underneath it. To grow, First Brands borrowed about $6 billion dollars in ordinary loans, the kind that gets sliced up and tucked inside the funds that hold your pension. But that was only the debt you could see. Underneath it sat a second engine, one that almost nobody was watching. By the end, it would be hiding billions more in debt than anyone on Wall Street had on their books. And there was a warning sign, if you knew where to look. When one lender asked to walk through the warehouses just to check the goods against the paperwork, the answer was simple. The executive who ran the financing put it plainly: we do not let lenders into the warehouse. What were they hiding? Something called factoring. And to understand the fall, you have to understand this one ordinary, perfectly legal trick, and how First Brands allegedly turned it into a weapon. Factoring is normal. Here is how it works. Say a giant retailer owes you $100,000, but they will not pay for 90 days. You do not want to wait that long, so you sell that unpaid invoice to a financier today for most of its value in cash, right now. They collect the full amount later and keep the difference. Simple. First Brands ran on this, but prosecutors say it twisted the trick into a weapon. First, they allegedly sold the same invoice to more than one financier at the same time. The same $100,000 pledged to 2 or 3 different lenders, every one of them believing they owned it. Then, they allegedly invented invoices for sales that never happened and inflated the value of the real ones. Look at one example prosecutors describe. A single invoice was sold to one financier for about $18,000. Then, 3 days later, the exact same invoice was sold to another financier for more than $460,000. The same piece of paper suddenly worth 25 times more. And because First Brands collected the customer payments itself before passing the money along, prosecutors say it could keep shuffling cash around to make everything look current. In effect, robbing one lender to pay another. Off the books, the hidden financing piled higher and higher, around $2.3 billion in factoring, another $800 million in supply chain finance, nearly $2 billion more in equipment leases. The $6 billion everyone could see was just the tip of the iceberg. For years, it all held together because nobody ever forced the company to stop and prove the money was real. Then, in the summer of 2025, First Brands went looking to refinance, to roll all of that debt into one fresh package worth around $6 billion. And the new lenders asked one simple, fatal question. Show us an independent report on your earnings, a clean look at the books. First Brands promised it. Weeks passed, and it never arrived. For lenders, that silence said everything. Confidence drained away in a matter of weeks. In mid-September, the company quietly stopped paying one of its lenders. On September 28, 2025, it filed for bankruptcy. And then came the number that stunned Wall Street. Over $9 billion in liabilities, and $12 million in cash. When one creditor told the court that as much as $2.3 billion had simply vanished, a lawyer asked how much was left in the protected account that held those invoices. The company's own lawyer gave a one-word answer: zero. Prosecutors would later say the financiers were left holding around $2.7 billion in fake receivables. So if the company was bleeding billions, where did the money actually go? The court-appointed investigator was blunt. First Brands, he wrote, was not a business. It was a mechanism for executives to gorge on wealth, sucking the company dry. He traced more than $700 million flowing out to Patrick James and entities he controlled. So where does $700 million from a brake pad company actually go? Prosecutors say hundreds of millions went straight to James himself. The company's own lawsuit goes further. It claims the money helped pay for 7 homes, a collection of 17 exotic cars, rent on a Manhattan townhouse, and a private celebrity chef. Sit with that contrast for a second. A man so private that almost nobody could find a photo of him. And on the other side of the ledger, 17 supercars and a personal chef. In January 2026, Patrick James and his brother Edward were arrested and charged with running a multi-billion-dollar fraud. Both pleaded not guilty, and neither has been convicted of anything. But the company's former finance chief has already pleaded guilty, and he is now cooperating with prosecutors. Here is why this story is so much bigger than one company. First Brands did not fall alone. In that very same month, a subprime auto lender called Tricolor also blew up with its own fraud allegations. 2 giants, hidden in the boring corners of finance, collapsing within weeks of each other. And it rattled the most powerful people in the room. On JP Morgan's earnings call, its boss, Jamie Dimon, gave the warning that defined the moment. When you see one cockroach, he said, there are probably more. Everyone should be forewarned on this one. And he had reason to worry. Jefferies, a major Wall Street firm, had around $715 million of exposure. The Swiss bank UBS had more than $500 million, and the rest of that debt was scattered across hundreds of funds, the kind sitting in your pension right now. The $6 billion everyone could see was always the tip. The dangerous part was the 9/10ths underwater, and that is the real lesson of First Brands. The most dangerous frauds do not look dangerous. They do not look exciting or risky or too good to be true. They look like spark plugs and oil filters. They look like the most boring company on earth, which is exactly why nobody looked. So here is what keeps me up at night. The auditors looked. The banks lent $6 billion. Nobody walked into the warehouse. So you tell me, is this just one rotten company, the bad apple we happened to catch, or is it simply the first cockroach we happen to see in a system that is quietly full of them? Drop your answer below.